What is the meaning crisis?
Yeah, the meaning crisis is... I mean, there have been meaning crises throughout history, but it's something that we're specifically going through now. It happens for two kinds of reasons. One is perennial, so there are problems that humans always face to an extent, to some extent, and there are then also acute or historical factors that make certain epochs more prone to the meaning crisis. So the perennial problems are things like combinatorial explosion, the fact there are too many things that we take into account when dealing with the world. There's too many things to potentially see, to do, to put into connection one with the other, and so on. So we need to use heuristics to block some parts of the world and function to compress reality down to blocks we can actually interact with. But when we do this, it means that we're blocking some parts of the world, and sometimes that will come back to bite us. And on the more acute historical level, some societies are better than others at finding ways to mitigate the risks of compression that we use to deal with the perennial problems. And our epoch has particular difficulty related to materialism. So other epochs have had meaning crises for other reasons. For instance, I mean, something very different from us. You can mention the plague that happened in the Middle Ages, where lots of people died, and people had a hard time fitting that within the Christian view of history that they had, where why would so many people die? Or you can think of the collapses in ancient civilizations, like the Bronze Age collapse, where lots of fairly complex civilizations had been built up and they collapsed. People didn't understand, loss of shared practices and systems of meaning and so on. So meaning crises happen from time to time, but certain epochs have more or less acute versions of them for different reasons. In our case, I argue in my book and in my writings, podcast in general, that one main driver is materialism, where we discovered something interesting during after the Middle Ages. I mean, we could go back pretty far, but when Europeans started to develop materialistic science, trying to reduce things down to physical entities that you could map out with numbers and use equations to start to predict the world, to build machines and so on. The early scientists and engineers who did that had enough success that they started to compound, and people started to think that you could explain more and more of the world in materialistic terms. And then slowly this hypothesis, this idea that ultimately we could just consider the external world to be just mathematizable entities. This idea started to gain more and more ground, not only in the sciences, but even in culture in general. And today you can hear still people say stuff like the emotion that I'm feeling is really just such and such hormones going through my brain or whatever. There's this, but not only does it have an immediate impact on us in that if we start to see ourselves as just ultimately physical particles following laws, personally, that would make me nihilistic right away. There's no meaning to life if I'm just a bunch of particles ultimately that are following the laws of physics. There's no real good or bad. There's just physics and evolution that builds upon physics, but really it's all just physics, no matter how complex it gets. But also, besides the abstract philosophical problems that this causes, there are also very direct ramifications, because materialism conflicts with systems that we had built to keep the meaning crisis at bay. I mentioned that there are historical problems. We are limited creatures, and we need systems that bind us with others and help us deal with difficult problems that we will inevitably face in our lives. Stuff like religions, and materialism came into conflict with religion since it started, and to the point where nowadays fairly few people belong to a major religious tradition that has the ability to help them deal with all kinds of problems. And we know this even from materialistic literature, you could say, like people who try to just study the impacts on well-being and that kind of stuff that religion adds. And we know that religion helps people, and it's not surprising, given that, as I said, there are perennial problems that we face, and we need complex institutions and practices that have evolved over time to help us deal with those problems. So if we lose these institutions and practices, then we're facing a meaning crisis. So I could obviously go on for longer, but in a nutshell, that's the meaning crisis in general and the one we're facing now.
So in your book, you begin with the myth of zombies, and that's what's on the cover as well. I like that logo or artwork on the cover. But so zombies are an interesting analogy to us and to the nihilism that we're suffering. And so I wanted you to talk a little bit about that. But as you were explaining the meaning crisis, I was wondering about nihilism or reductionist materialism as a potential system or institution that blocks us from suffering the consequences of the combinatorial explosiveness of life and all of the problems that we suffer there.
The zombie is a very powerful myth, maybe the most powerful myth we have to understand the meaning crisis right now. For like one, let's say, reason that we can put in more philosophical terms, but even one reason that's very, very theological. So on the more, let's say, philosophical or sociological level, the zombie represents materialism in general, in that it's a creature that only cares, I mean, there's many layers, but it's a creature that only cares about immediate material consumption, doesn't care about the humanity of the people it interacts with. It just wants to eat them, and specifically it wants to eat their brain. And that's significant because the brain is the one big problem for materialists that they cannot ignore, and that they've been butting their heads against for a few decades now. As I started to say earlier, when the early scientists and engineers started to see the world in materialistic terms, in ultimately just physics and equations, they had quite a bit of success mapping out the external world. There's lots of stuff they were able to explain for a long time, and at some point they started to stumble upon issues, and I'm sure we'll talk about those issues later. But they had so much success in physical science especially, and engineering, building more and more complex machines, that intuitively people start to think that we will ultimately explain everything through this materialistic reductionistic paradigm, including the human consciousness. At some point people thought, okay, well, I mean, the brain is really just neuroscience, and neuroscience is really just chemistry, and chemistry is really just physics, so we should just at some point be able to understand it all in this old materialistic reductionistic paradigm. And initially, I mean, people only had, let's say, philosophical arguments against this. But I mean, after several decades of attempts at understanding the brain and creating intelligent machines and other stuff that bubbled up in cognitive science, people started to shift away from this. But I'm sure we'll get back to this, but in any case, for the myth of the zombie specifically, what happened was that the brain was the one thing that materialists were trying to eat, you could say, to integrate into their materialistic system. So the fact that you have a creature that only cares about the lowest level of human life and wants to eat specifically the brain is an image of materialism. You can also mention the social impacts of materialism. We use the zombie in part to reflect on our own social problems, because many people have noticed that we're very atomized now as a society. We might, like a zombie, we might be surrounded by lots of people who look like us and do the same kind of stuff, but we're not really united with them. A horde or zombie doesn't have friendships and meaningful relationships. They just follow the same kind of movement, and they don't even really have a direction either. I mean, obviously, in a materialistic world where you're just blindly following the laws of physics, there's no real direction, purpose, or anything. So people are just following whatever direction they have. Also, the zombie doesn't have a place to to stay and build stuff. They're just always on the move, and it's also one aspect of materialistic culture. People feel like, I mean, there's many things, but let's say materialistic progress makes things change all the time. It's hard to dig down the roots. Also, people will move for work reasons rather than stay with their family where they grew up and so on. So people feel uprooted, like a zombie again. The zombie also doesn't have the ability to speak about really anything, but the fact that the zombie can only grunt and not speak, I think is related to the fact that in a materialistic world, we cannot talk about stuff besides matter. We cannot talk about important things. And you can see that at an abstract level in the fact that with materialistic philosophy, you saw a loss in philosophical sophistication in intellectual circles, and also at the very grassroots level, I would have to think back and look at research on this, but I remember seeing research to the effect that people use less and less moral categories, less and less theological categories to navigate their existence. For instance, I think one thing I have to remember is that rather than saying that something is good or bad, people will say that something is smart or not smart. So there's a collapse of even moral categories. So we cannot talk about, let's say, higher levels of existence. We are sort of doomed to talk about the lowest levels that we can, like the zombie that cannot even talk. There's all of these parallels, you could say, at the sociological and philosophical level between materialism and what we're going through. But even further, many people have observed, I'm not the first one to do this, there's even non-Christians who have observed this, that the zombie is also a caricature of Christianity. It's a caricature of the resurrection and a caricature of the Eucharist, where the zombie is a parody of the general resurrection, where everyone is alive and is supposed to have a higher level of existence. The zombie is alive forever, but has a lower level of existence than we have. And rather than the zombie giving his life away like Christ does in the Eucharist, what you have is the zombie just eating people without ever being thankful. And Eucharist means the sacrifice of thanksgiving, sacrifice of praise. So the zombie does the opposite. So not only is the zombie a good representative to help us think about the social problems we're going through with our materialism, but it's also specifically a good symbol for us to understand how a Christian culture can degenerate into materialism. And the other aspect you said was how materialistic reductionism is shielding us from some of the problems of combinatorial explosion. It's a good question. People hadn't asked me this before, but I think in general with the worldview, you can always think about what does it let its users do well and what it doesn't let them do well, to see what kind of frame it's doing. In terms of what it's doing well, it's obviously great at making us understand the physical workings of the world and build machines, build lots of material wealth in general, lots of food, lots of housing, lots of eating and so on. I would be miserable without modern buildings where I'm living right now in Quebec, where it's still -5 or something outside. So I think it's great at this. Even from some of the perennial problems that are of a more abstract nature, I do think that for a good chunk of people, materialistic reductionism is sort of enough. I don't think I should be careful. It's they won't notice the shortcomings. For instance, Richard Dawkins doesn't seem to mind at all that he's a materialist. I think with certain personality traits, some people might be fine. I think maybe people of a more abstract and intellectual disposition might be fine with materialism. It's still tricky because you could argue that, let's say, Dawkins doesn't notice that his Christian culture has shaped him, let's say, morally, so that he's not really a nihilist, even if at the intellectual level he's a nihilist. But still, in general, I wouldn't be surprised if people who are, let's say, hyper conscientious and much more interested by things and by people would be fine being materialist and just trying to understand the world like all in terms of physics and equations and complex systems. I think that for a certain amount of people, that's probably fine. It means they don't have to think about stuff that isn't like normal for their own personality. So a certain percentage of the population is probably shielded from things that would make them grow as humans, but that they don't want to grow into. So that's working for some people. But I think like for the vast majority of people, it's materialism is destroying their relationships, and it's also, I mean, causing all the problems we said earlier for the vast majority of people. Most people don't want to just be like alone, engaged in abstract reflections all day.
Yes, I've noticed. The interesting thing about what you just said is a world that's focused on material, I think, will necessarily improve its material appeal or comfort or whatever, because it is so important. And it's sort of like a Tom Holland thesis that the Western world is shaped writ large by Christianity, specifically the crucifixion and the resurrection, and the story that wrought upon history is that people are important. And so we come from a place of relationality as fundamental or primary, all of these things, and then over time shift away from that understanding through this scientific philosophical move towards the reductionist materialism, which is fascinating because we still have these like ghosts of Christian morality within our system. So then it's like, well, you don't want people to be suffering. Well, why not? Well, you just don't. Okay, great. And so that sort of the afterburn of that is still sufficient to cause society to be good, but materialist. And so I think we're finding maybe a deceleration and a disintegration of what was founded on people, the value of people. We hold these truths to be self-evident, is what my government's founded on. These things that were truly a religio, like binding together all of the people that have their various interests and experience as. And so then when you improve material existence to the point where you couldn't even notice, or put it a different way, when you begin to suffer the consequences of something being material and reductionist rather than personal and non-reductionist, you can turn to these material resources that you've accumulated. It's sort of like the rich man not being able to get into heaven sort of problem, where you just never get to the point where you need to recognize a higher power. That's a huge thing for Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's a group that I feel like there can't possibly be enough groups for our current society, right? Like everyone is suffering from some form of narcissistic addiction issues, whether they take the form of alcohol or any number of the myriad things that we can be addicted to in our culture. Anyway, that was just something that popped up for me. Have you ever read the book Consilience by E.O. Wilson?
No, I haven't.
Jordan Peterson turned me on to it, but it's a wonderful look at some of the similar things that you're talking about here, sort of the shortcomings of a reductionist materialist view of science. And really, he's talking more along the lines of like how the physical sciences sort of overtook and then pushed away the humanities. And so he just wants us to have this consilience where you start to, that the word means jump things together. And so you just like put these things together and see how they connect in different ways. Actually, I just listened to the conversation you had with Jonathan Pajot a year ago about this book. And you were talking about learning music or learning visual arts as a way of connecting to the broader physical realities. But one of the quotes that I just set aside a few quotes, I'll bring them up throughout. But he said, a mantra of science is, the explanations of the physical sciences are necessary, but not sufficient. And I think that that's a sort of formula that I've been applying to a lot of things as I observe them in my young adult life here. Like institutions, I see often tend to fall into this trap of thinking that they are sufficient when in reality they're only necessary. And there's a big difference between something that's necessary and sufficient. And I've been using the phrase like, when an institution terminates on itself, becomes the end in and of itself, then it no longer serves the function that it had originally. And so I just wonder if you've observed the same thing, not necessarily institutionally, but just in general, with the way that we just get locked into a physical understanding, as though a soul is not something meaningful unless you can prove its existence.
Yeah, I think it's part of the perennial kind of problems we mentioned earlier, where the world is too complex, so we have to simplify. And when, let's say, we go for a certain kind of model, consciously or unconsciously, I think, by the way, you can see in Galileo that materialism was an explicit hypothesis. Like, he wasn't sure that it was true, but he said, okay, we'll try it for the external world. He didn't think at all it would work for humans or the qualitative world, but he said, okay, we'll make this hypothesis. Obviously, for many people after him, they didn't know it was an hypothesis, but still they used materialism as a frame to block off certain things in the world and only consider certain other things in the world. And when you have a frame like this, especially when you're changing a frame, like let's say we'll become more materialistic, and then let's say that you notice a new problem that arises. Let's say, I don't know, depression rates are starting to rise, or maybe you're noticing that communities are starting to fracture, and maybe there's more conflicts between states that are emerging. So anyway, like you see, you start to notice problems now that you're moving to a new frame. The question is always, okay, do I need to do more of what we just did, or do I need to backtrack and do something else? And because you're dealing with problems that are at such high scales, it's never obvious which one of those two options is true. There's always some people who can engage at like a very abstract level of argumentation to try to determine it, but most people will sort of feel their way around the problem, and intuitively they'll do one or the other. And I think you can always see both streams. In all societies, whenever you adopt a new frame that faces a problem, I think you can always see some people who want to backtrack and go for something different, and you can see other people who are just gonna want to double down and fix the new problems that we're facing with the frame that got us there. And sometimes it's true. Sometimes you just need to do more of what you've been doing, but sometimes you do need to backtrack and do something else. So I do think that lots of people are, let's say, stuck into materialism. There are also people who are swimming back. You can find authors who have been arguing against materialism since it came about, really. I'd say they're becoming more and more vocal. They are arguably a majority in the cognitive sciences now. Last I spoke with, even years ago, when I spoke with John the first time in like 2018 or whatever, already told me that in the cognitive sciences, majority of researchers didn't think that materialism was true. I think it's even more so the case now. You can even see in biology now people walking that back. Like Michael Levin is changing lots of people's minds with his research in Platonism. So there is a backtrack, but I do think that lots of people are just doubling down, and I wonder how long it's gonna go. As you said too, there's lots of material comforts that people can opt for intuitively. So people who don't go, to be fair, it's still very, or still quite intellectual, let's say, for a lot of people, the move away from materialism. I think it's getting more intuitive. You can see lots of people going back to church because they can feel that the culture is ripping apart, especially younger people. Actually, very interesting, just I think last Friday, I saw some stats coming from my province in Quebec that there was a big boost in the number of 18 to 24-year-olds who identify as Catholic versus 25 to 34-year-old. you were seeing a drop like every generation. From like the baby boomers onwards, you had fewer and fewer people identify as Catholic, and then the lowest generation here in Quebec was around 24%, I think, but or 20% or so between the 25 to 34-year-olds. But if you look at the younger generation, so 15 to 20, 18 to 24-year-olds, it jumps back to 40%, a pretty dramatic jump. And you're observing stuff like this in many places in the world right now. And for many of those people, it's very intuitive. Like they can tell, okay, what we've been doing, just doubling down on materialism for the past 500 years, it's not working. I'm gonna walk that back and go back to Catholicism in the case of Quebec, for instance. So it's definitely happening. But I see also people who just want to double down and think, okay, like I'm not happy right now. I'm suffering for whatever reason. I just need more technology to satisfy my material desires. Young people are not happy because it's harder to buy houses or whatever. Like people I see lots of people who still keep doubling down.
Yeah, I agree. And I also like know about the trends with Gen Z, Gen Alpha really moving back into the religious spaces. I guess for me, it's an interesting aspect of this would be maybe thinking through the lens of just the trend of AI as it stands currently. Because it seems like, oh, the new technology, these Gen Alpha kids will be so good at using this technology. But I think that what you're saying is they're intuiting sort of it's almost like when a tree is dying, like the branches are damaged or the trunk further up is damaged, it will shoot out a bunch of these new trunks essentially from the stump. And so it's trying to like compress down its survival mechanisms and make sure that it could stay alive. But usually this means like it's too far gone and the tree will be dead within the year or two. And I feel like with AI, you would assume that the younger generation would kind of take this on and work with it, but it almost looks to me like the older generations are sort of disseminating this as like because they believe in it so much, because it's like the hyper materialism economy that they have come from. And so as these economic instabilities affect the younger generation, which is really like once you start to try to get out of your parents' home and you start to try to buy a home or get a job or all of these different things that are so difficult, then you start to say, wait, why are we doing it this way? Like why are our priorities the way that they are? Because you don't have the experience that your parents or their parents have had with the maybe general successes of materialism. And so we're at this crazy transition point between not only the cultural, religious, spiritual, philosophical things that we're shifting our stance on, but also sort of the consequences of those beliefs as they've run their course. And so when it comes to what are you going to do for work, well, everybody's a little bit nervous that whatever you thought you were going to do is going to be done by AI. And so then what are you going to do for meaning? I don't know. A lot of people are worried about how the younger generation is, they're on YouTube and they're streaming video games and whatever else that they're doing. But I think in general, when it comes to what connects us, I think people will be searching more and more for something that can transcend the transition, right? Because as you move from one system to the next to block out the perennial problems that we face, I think that you will be searching for something that spans that gap. Because otherwise, I don't know, like the boomers seem to be pretty convinced about AI. Oh, it's going to be so good and effective, but like I don't know that it will be, right? And because of the uncertainty, I think you'll look at something more like religion to bind people together. I had a question about the spiritual and the non-spatio-temporal, because in your book you talk about, in the first section, as you're sort of arguing against this reductionist material and maybe the sufficiency of that worldview. You're bringing up the fact that there are forms and there are what's the other thing? I'm sorry, I'm spacing on that. There's forms and
form and potential.
Potential, yes, yeah. Forms and potential that are maybe they supersede the actual instantiations of them, and so there is a form of human beingness that exists outside of you and outside of me, and it's not spatial or temporal, non-spatio-temporal. And I was wondering about that and your view on that as something spiritual. And I'll add a little caveat. I like Dallas Willard a lot, and he describes spirit as a non-physical, personal power. And so there's like a agency or a will that's associated with it. So I wanted to know how you might define those non-spatio-temporal things.
There are many ways to approach it, but the way that I try out in the book is aimed at, the audience of the book. I wrote the book mainly for people who have a background in materialistic reductionism, so people who tend to give a lot of weight to science. So for that kind of audience, I think that introducing forms using math and physics is probably easiest. I don't know how much experience you have in math and doing proofs, but when, let's say, you learn how to prove a certain theorem and it clicks for you, you really have the experience that, okay, like this is true independently of me knowing it. It's true independent of anyone seeing the proof. It was true from before time. Even if there had been no physical universe at all, this would still be true. So I won't give you a proof of something mathematical right now. I'll let people try it out if they haven't, but it's very common for people who learn about math at the level at which you do proofs that, okay, there exist patterns that are not spatial temporal. It's called mathematical Platonism. It's a position in philosophy of mathematics that has been defended since Plato, really. There have always been mathematicians very serious who think so. I mean, there are alternatives. Some people are constructivists, meaning that they think that mathematics is something that you construct but doesn't have an independent reality of its own. We could go into those kinds of debates, but I just want to point out that like mathematical Platonism is a respectable position.
I just wanted to interject because I'm terrible at math. So no, I haven't had that experience and probably never will. I don't know. But I had the exact experience when I converted from my reductionist materialism of my teenage years to belief in God. And it was through Jordan Peterson's Genesis lectures that I began to understand that the things that the Bible was talking about were true, whether or not I believed them. And that was a huge shift for me away from a constructivist view of the scripture or the religion that I grew up in, because I assumed that these things were like nice or helpful to believe a certain way was good for you. And I did not make that next step where it clicked that they're describing real true things. And so then it's been like 6 or 7 years of me just thinking, oh, that's what's real, right? And so when I'm trying to engage in my relationship with God and adjust myself to be able to be humble enough or obedient enough or any of these things to perceive what God is saying to me, asking me to do, that is really just an attempt to align myself with reality, right? And that's how I would characterize wisdom, as sort of an alignment with reality. And so that made a huge difference in my life to make it to where it all of a sudden, something that was written 2,000 years ago is extremely relevant to me because we're talking about the same things.
Yeah, that's good to know. I mean, we can even get to those kinds of truths later. I'll keep trying to build from the ground up of just math, because above math you have physics. So physical laws, I mean, most people don't think that they are eternal in the same sense that math is eternal. Like mathematical truths, they couldn't have been otherwise, but probably the physical world could have been different. Like probably there could have been other physical laws and would still have been okay for the spatial temporal world. But still, if you take an equation in physics that describes the world, if you want to say that physics is a real science that studies real things, it's much easier in your philosophy of physics and your philosophy of science to say that, okay, physical forms actually exist. Like this equation exists, is describing real things. Like E equals mc squared is something that exists. It's not just a construction that describes the world or whatever. Because if you start to say that everything you do, even at the level of physics, is construction, and the reality is something like behind that you can't access, pretty quickly the whole edifice of science becomes just constructions that don't really give you access to the whole thing. And then you're using constructions like, I don't know, you're using a microscope or whatever to access something, and like you're just like imposing layers of illusion between you and the world, and the process of science becomes uninteresting. And in the philosophy of science, it's I don't recommend it. I think it's much nicer. Most people, I think, would rather take every level of the physical ontology, of the scientific ontology, as being real and non-reducible to the others. So I introduce forms this way, using math as an example, but then there are forms that are much more complicated and interesting than just like the Pythagorean theorem, for example. I think physical laws are another example of form. They're abstract relationships between entities, but forms can be more interesting than that. They're not just spatial, they're not just math. You can also think about biological forms. So I don't know how much you know about Michael Levin, for instance, but that's a good recent example. He came out like in print as a Platonist fairly recently, I think maybe the last year or two. But you can find podcasts of him explaining this a few years back. But he's done stuff in biology to show, I think, fairly convincingly that the structures that you see in microorganisms, even very simple things like clumps of cells, are not reducible to just genomics or microbiology. They are Platonic forms. They're much more complicated than the Pythagorean theorem or even physical laws, but they are forms with certain purposes, and he sees minds in general this way. So even I don't know how much you know, so I don't want to go too much into this, and just explaining this can take like 20 minutes. But all that is to say, in biology right now, it's not weird to say that there exist forms outside of their spatial temporal instantiations that animate living beings. And when we do this, we're getting closer to spiritual realities. I think when you get to the human level and above, we can talk about above too, you're talking a bit again about patterns that exist outside of space and time, like akin to mathematical patterns, but they're more complex. Like human beings have goals. They have also vices and virtues. They can participate in good and bad and so on. They have intention in the way that you don't see in mathematical forms or physical laws, for instance.
I do kind of maybe want to double click on the Michael Levin stuff. Mm-hmm. I'm unfamiliar. I've heard him referenced a few times, but you know how it is. There's so much on the algorithm and so little time. And so I guess when it comes to the bacteria, and we're talking about forms, I'm wondering about just, this is like an imaginal space in my mind, an ecosystem, and there are sort of all these different niches that creatures can fill into. Is that what we're talking about? Like there's a space for something to take its form, or is it different than that? And I don't know if Levin speaks on this or if you follow my question even, but
I mean, I'll try to explain it the way that Levin explains. with some of his experiments. Maybe the best is just to try it with an experiment, and you'll see the kind of stuff that he's pointing to. So one crazy thing that he discovered is that if you take tracheal cells, so cells from the inside of our throat, and you put them in a petri dish. I don't think he's doing much besides that, to be honest. Put them in a petri dish where they have like food and humidity and so on. They will spontaneously clump together into a kind of organism that we have never seen before, that does stuff that we have never seen before. Like it's going to do intelligent stuff that evolution hasn't prepared it for. So for instance, these things will clump together and they will use it's like small airs, like in the same way that like we have small airs in our throat to like make stuff move. They'll use those like at the outside of the clumps to move around. These cells will be able to surprisingly repair neural networks that are severed. Who knows why? And they will also be able to reproduce in a way that was never seen otherwise, which is that if there are loose throat cells floating around, they'll be able to incorporate them into the clump and make them part of like that microorganism. It's not able to reproduce by like cellular division, like a normal cell at its normal place. But and also, if you look at the genes that are expressed in such an anthrobot, that's what Levin calls it, because it's kind of like a robot, but like from humans. The genes that are expressed are very different from the genes that are expressed normally within the throat. So the Platonic explanation for this, and Levin backs this up with other similar results or other results pointing in similar directions. The interpretation is that you cannot reduce cellular biology to the genes. What you have instead is a certain world of forms. This is the form of normal. In the world of forms, there are the forms for normal tracheal cells, but there are also anthrobots. And depending on the like what's possible at the potential level, like what is possible within the material level of those cells and their environment, the forms are going to sort of fight to control and shape that potentiality. So when the tracheal cells are in the throat, they're surrounded by other tracheal cells and they communicate with all kinds of ion channels. When they have this sort of pattern, then the normal form of the tracheal cell will be informing the potential there. Things will go well, unless like, something can go wrong sometimes. Like a cancer, for instance, is an instance where this the form is not landing well. Another form will take its place, and the communication across other cells will change. The environment will change, and then from then on, you can have like a cascade where the wrong kind of form is going to land and take space, and maybe even kill the entire organism. But in the case of the anthrobot, what you have is not something you can explain by previous generations of natural selection and genomics, because there's no evolutionary pressure for tracheal cells to do the kind of stuff that you see them do. And it's way too complex to just be explained by chance. So it means that there are intelligent forms that are informing that potential. So we can even go back to what I said earlier. It's akin to, let's say, physics. In physics, let's say you have you can go very low. You have like probability waves at the fundamental level of physics, and those probability waves can be informed by patterns, by forms, to make them like collapse into something actual. But then also in biology, you have a certain potential in like some like chemistry, some biochemistry going on in, let's say, a tracheal cell. And this biochemistry can be informed, shaped, structure, whatever word you want to use, into an anthrobot or a normal cellular matrix. So that's why Levin is a Platonist. He thinks that these forms really do exist, and they shape the material support in ways that you cannot explain just at the level of the material support.
Yeah. Wow. That is super crazy, and I'll be following up with Mr. Levin. I guess I don't know where you think we should go from here, because I think there might be one more step before the next question I have, but I'm sort of wondering, what is that intelligence that is drawing even the Anthrobot, but all forms into, or all instantiations of forms into that space where they instantiate?
You mean what is drawing? Like, where do the forms come from?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, good question. I don't know how quickly we want to talk about God from that point. I guess there's a few things we can say. One is, if you look at, let's say, mathematical truths, maybe I tend to go back to this because it's the simplest layer. Mathematical truths all interlock. Like, because you have like one theorem feeding into another theorem and so on. And like the whole edifice stands together. And you can also see some of this with physics, but it gets fuzzier the higher you go into the hierarchy of forms, because we don't know as much. I mean, we know very little about biological forms, for instance. Michael Levin has started all of this stuff fairly recently, and he's trying to discover all of these forms and study them and see how we can sort of hook into them. He has created machines that will help him do this kind of stuff automatically, but we don't know a lot about the world of biological forms. So, I mean, for now, I suppose if you wanted to like approach this bottom up, I think it would be difficult to see where the whole, like how the whole hierarchy of forms is structured. You can see, I guess you can see that lower forms always feed into higher ones. That's for sure you can see. Like, for instance, the forms that you see in physics will feed into the forms that you see in chemistry, and then chemistry will feed into biology and so on. But it's hard to see like the whole thing. I suppose the argument I have ultimately to see where forms come from, let's say, what's the most fundamental pattern for me is really in the Incarnation. Before even we talk explicitly about God, for me it's the Incarnation to understand the pattern of all of creation. Maybe before we talk about the Incarnation, an example like at a lower scale we can mention to get the pattern of or let's say to find explanatory patterns is one I always go to, but in science in general, the way you introduce a new theory to replace other theories is that you propose a pattern that might look crazy, like justified, if we try to justify it on existing theories and frameworks, but you ask people to grant your hypothesis for a moment, and then you try to show that you'll explain more stuff with the new theory without making new mistakes. And then, no matter how weird the metaphysics might look for what you introduced, people will eventually accept it. So this happened across the board, but one example that I like to use is Newton, because now Newtonian physics seems totally uncontroversial and normal for us, but when Newton introduced his physics, people thought he was completely crazy, because back then the frame that people had in materialistic reductionistic science was mechanistic. People thought that ultimately it's all like physical things pushing and pulling against each other, and the idea that you could have emptiness with a force mysteriously acting at a distance like gravity was just totally impossible within scientists' frame back then. So Newton was dismissed on theoretical grounds, you can say, by his contemporaries. But why Newton won out was that if you granted him a few equations in his system, even if the metaphysics looked weird, he was able to explain stuff that people couldn't explain before, like the orbits of planets, why they're circular, and all kind of stuff that people couldn't explain before. And he made no new mistake. And he could make predictions, like very precise predictions about what will happen with such and such, and other people couldn't make such predictions. And when people tested it, Newton turned out to be right. So people ended up adopting the frame in Newton's system because in practice it explained more stuff than what you had before. And by the way, you could say the same thing about Michael Levin. Michael Levin with his Platonism is able to explain things and like create, like think of new things to try that other people didn't think of and can't explain in their own system. So that's why his Platonic system is gaining ground in biology, even if the metaphysics look insane for previous generations of biologists who were staunchly materialistic. So where do all forms come from? Let's see, what's the pattern behind all the patterns? The best candidate I've seen, the best theory of everything, you could say, is the Incarnation, in my opinion. Because the Incarnation is able to explain many, many facts about the world that no other competing theory is able to explain, in my mind. There's a few we can... By the way, I'm taking this kind of argumentation from C.S. Lewis in his book Miracles. I think that's arguably the best book on understanding the symbolism of the Incarnation. What I try to do largely in my own book is try to update the book with newer science, because Lewis was really opposed to, let's say, framing his book against the materialism of his time, the science of his time, which was very materialistic. But now that science is becoming less and less materialistic, especially in cognitive science and now even biology, we can rewrite things for a more modern audience in mind. And it will also let us use the Incarnation to explain certain things that Lewis wouldn't have thought to explain before. So one that is especially dear to me is the fact that both forms and potential exist, and we're not giving priority to one over the other. Because, I mean, some history, why this might sound like an abstract thing for me to be fond of, but why this is important to me as someone who's interested in science is that, in philosophy you could say, is that for the ancients, in most ancient philosophies, people were the opposite of materialists. People were all, I guess you could say idealists, but like top-down Platonists was the norm, really. People that thought that like the existence of forms was obvious to the ancient Greeks, for instance, and the same in Hindu philosophy. The existence of God, of the origin of forms from which lower and lower forms emanate all the way down to, let's say, the physical forms. This was obvious to them. But what was not obvious to them was that potential really existed and wasn't just some kind of illusion. And you have a contradiction of this already in Genesis. Like the Jews clearly like situated themselves against this because they said that God didn't only create the heavens, he also created the earth. So like God is behind both forms, the forms in the heavens, but he's also behind the potential, the earth. And then you can see like this has huge ramifications, because the way things are created then in Genesis is always a participation of the higher and the lower. There's like God speaks something, so there's a form coming, but it's always to invite something to come from the bottom up to fill up the form, you can say. So let the earth bring forth the grass, let's say. So there, like God says a name, says something, says a form, and then the earth will raise up into that form. So you have this unit of matter and form, and this obviously culminates in the Incarnation, where God himself, who is behind form and matter altogether, will come and unite to creation that emerges with a body to unite with God. And ultimately all of creation and God can be united in the Incarnation. So, and it's not trivial. Like this might seem obvious, like the idea that both the top down and the bottom up are important might seem obvious to us. It wasn't obvious for the ancient Greeks. It's also not obvious for real materialists, like real materialists who think that only the bottom up, the bottom layer is real and forms are just constructions, let's say. They also cannot have the Incarnation. Like the Incarnation, you can see the Incarnation as a bulwark against like abuses of either kinds. You can't just say that only God is real and the world isn't real. You can't only say that only the bottom layer is real and everything else is an illusion. The illusion lets you have both of those things, and it's the only system that I've ever seen that's able to do this. And you can see it, I mean, starting with Judaism, with Genesis, but it's like most obvious in the Incarnation. And there are other things that the Incarnation explains, in my opinion, that no other system can explain. But for me, let's say on a theoretical level, why I find Christianity to be the theory of everything is that it's the only thing I see that can explain why there are so many layers of reality, from like pure potential all the way up to the highest of forms, and why all of these layers can so elegantly, let's say, coexist together. It's because you can see like ultimately they're all meant to fit together in the story of the Incarnation, when all the layers of reality and even God fit together.
Just to recap here, so the ancient top-down understanding of these things is a little bit more deterministic, I suppose. So God speaks, and then it must be that way, and it comes from the top down. And you can see how maybe then your theology becomes a little bit more important or something. And so there's like there's an importation of the will of God from the top down, and this is how it is and should be. So you have a little bit more of a moral backbone there, but maybe you tend towards moralism. And then with our current modern bottom up understanding of life, and then all of the higher strata there, you have less moral grounding, because you don't have some sort of like higher form or even just hierarchy to really climb or build up into. So then the Incarnation for you is that middle point where it draws on both of these theories, the good, and sort of balances out the excesses of either theory, because maybe the bottom up understanding lacks some of that morality, because where do you find it, where do you ground it, and so you have God's desire for this coming down, top down, to shape everything. But then in God's desire, you also find like a willing participation is necessary. You must participate within God's desires in order to maybe fully take the form that He's offering to you, or something like that. That's really beautiful and interesting, and I'd love to continue on this path of your findings about the Incarnation as a theory of everything here.
Yeah, there's a maybe I can say more also, like if you're interested on the moral aspect, like the ancient cultures that had a top-down way of expressing their metaphysics also had a top-down way to structure society and to view the strong versus the weak. So it's why, like in I don't know, you have the caste systems in Hinduism, or why you also have poor views of women and children in Greco-Roman philosophy and society. And even in terms of, it's interesting you mentioned determinism, because there's D.C. Schindler talks about it in one of his books on freedom, that for the ancient Greeks, God has freedom, like God can do whatever he wants, but there's sort of no freedom from the bottom up. There's free will, you can say, in God in the Greek system, but like there's no freedom in creatures. Like creatures are shaped by the form that they get, and then that's it. And then conversely, what Christianity fixes with the system is that it gives weight to the bottom up. And I think at a philosophical level, let's say this becomes explicit in Saint Dionysius in, like, I don't know, 5th or 6th century, pretty early on in Christianity, maybe 4th century, I'm not sure. Anyway, like very early in the history of Christianity, it became clear that you need to give equal weight to both forms and potential, with all the ramifications that this has. And what you can see in Christian morality is that immediately, like as soon as the crucifixion happened, people start to value the poor, the weak, the children, and so on, in a way that was unthinkable in the Greco-Roman world, and that like is really unprecedented in other systems in general.
Just to interrupt there, I got to speak with Aaron Von Oss recently, and he and I spoke about Nietzsche and Nietzsche's critique of Christianity, and I find that critique, I don't know how familiar you are, but generally he sort of is upset that Christians have inverted the moral structure of the world to say that like weakness is actually to be is a higher value than strength. And so he views it as a sort of like unjust, we actually we're getting it backwards here because we inverted it. And so what I appreciate about his critique is that um if you are to do away with, I don't know, value hierarchies because you're trying to subvert them with some sort of like, it's a sneaky move to say like, well, I'm worse at this, so I'm actually better than you, And so I understand that, and I think some people play Christianity out in that backwards, sneaky way. But then what you're saying here is a little bit truer, that Christians actually found the value of the weak, the poor, women and children, all of these things that were classically just denigrated in society, and were able to, bring the lower together with the higher in a way that, well, theory of everything, like, oh, now everything makes sense together rather than before, where it's like, I don't know, the wheat and the chaff, or the survival of the fittest. Like, let's get rid of these extra things that are dragging us down. So that was a little bit rambly, but my thought is Nietzsche is critiquing our incorporation of the weak. But why is it to you that you see that as such a benefit to the way that things have gone historically?
Yeah, I mean, I think what it's interesting because I argue with, let's say, how Nietzsche is diagnosing how we are, let's say, a branch of society went too far because of Christianity. So I think what Christianity did was to give as much weight to forms as it did to matter, as much importance to the top-down as it did to the bottom-up, unlike the Greek system, which was only top-down. But I think inevitably what happened, I don't know if it was, I guess it was inevitable, in, let's say, establishing this harmony by giving place to the bottom-up, what happened is that some people did take the bottom-up too far. Not just in morality, like I think we are seeing this. I guess we've been seeing this since revolutions have started to happen more and more. A revolution is when you give more place to the bottom up than to the top down, to the new emerging thing over the previously top down tradition, let's say. But in philosophy and science, you also see this. I think science wouldn't have been possible without Christianity, because like the ancient Greeks, ancient philosophers, you cannot see any like important intellectual back in the day that gave a lot of importance to like low level physical laws and that kind of stuff. It wasn't interesting to them. Like what was interesting was just the top down, like starting from pure ideas and trying to understand the world. That's what the vast majority of people did. Even the closest you can see maybe is Aristotle, who like tried to systematize things to an extent, but still like wouldn't never have occurred to him to do the kinds of experiments that people do now. Like he wouldn't find like important truths starting from particulars in a system. You always start from the top down. But then you can see through the centuries that like in the Middle Ages, you have some monks who start to do experiments and that kind of stuff. And ultimately it bubbles up into the scientific revolution, where intellectually you have very smart people who start to think of the world bottom up, and that's how science gets going. So you can see this like intellectually, scientifically, but as I said, you can also start to see it morally. Like people start to give more value, or at least pretend to give more value to the poor, disenfranchised, and so on, to break up old systems and build new systems. And I do think that this is a perversion of Christianity. Christianity is both top down and bottom up. So I do think that insofar as Nietzsche is criticizing the inversion, I think he's right to criticize the inversion. I think Christians should criticize the inversion too. It's supposed to be both. So, I mean, for instance, it's very common now, because of the, let's say, the bottom-up excesses in our culture, it's very common for people to see just the revolutionary aspects of Jesus in the Gospels. But there are many... Most of the time when people do this, if you just zoom out a little bit and you see like in the wider context what Jesus is doing both the bottom up and the top down. So, I mean, maybe the greatest parable on this that people like don't push enough is the banquet parable. So there's a feast that's organized by a king. I think I don't remember the exact title, but like someone important is setting up a banquet, and the people who are supposed to come don't come to the banquet. So that would be like typically people interpret this as the Jews, the chosen people, the people who have been prepared to receive this, and because they don't come, what do what does the king decide to do? He's going to invite more people. So like take whoever, like go in the street and let people come in. So traditionally that's interpreted as the nations coming in. So the Greeks, the Romans and whatever, like coming into the wedding feast that the Jews didn't want to accept. So you let everyone come in. Like people like that part of the story now. Like the bottom up aspect, okay, like there was this whole strict hierarchy with the law coming down since the Jews, and the Jews were excluding all kinds of people, and now with Jesus we just let everyone in. Like people love that part of the story. But then what Jesus says is that if the people who are invited don't dress properly, so if they don't accept the form that's given for the marriage, then they will be set out in the utter darkness where there will be gnashing and weeping of teeth. So they're in a far worse place than they were previously when they were just let to be where they were. So there you have both. Okay, there's the mana. We give weight to the people who were excluded, but then they have to participate in the system. They have to participate in the top-down hierarchy where there is a king and there are things expected of them.
One of the things that came up in my conversation with Aaron about Nietzsche is that he was operating in a culture and a tradition that was heavily influenced by Luther. And so all of the, Luther is like, he's kind of a crazy guy. You can think lots of different things about him, but one of the things that is rampant in Protestantism today is a saved by grace alone understanding of the gospel, and understanding of even like, say there is top down. I mean, it's all top down, right? And so it's a strange thing where the bottom up revolution with the theses on the door is actually claiming that it's only what the top does, and so then that would be to me like the people that go to that banquet and don't change at all. That's one of the concerns that I have about a saved by grace alone sort of understanding of the way that the world works, because it leads to essentially like Christian nihilism, where well, God's got it all taken care of. He's working top down, and I just have to sort of lay here and let it all happen to me. And it's like, I think that leads to nihilism in the sense that nothing matters, like what I do or what I don't do. But then, really, like at an existential level, like, oh, well, why am I? Why do I believe this? Like just so I don't go to hell. I mean, I feel like it's a sort of hell to believe that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't. I mean, I'm not. There aren't a lot of Protestants around me because I'm in Quebec, where there's only like Catholics and the lapsed Catholics, pretty much. But it is interesting to think about how, as you said, in theory, like with Luther, you have a metaphysics where I suppose, yeah, it's like grace comes from the top down, and then the bottom up doesn't have anything to do. And in a way, yeah, like. That's interesting. I suppose, yeah, like everything in Christian metaphysics, what you're supposed to have is a complete interpenetration of both. So you're supposed to have like just constant striving, but knowing that God from the top down is always trying to help.
Yes. I mentioned Dallas Willard earlier. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's phenomenal. And then John Mark Comer has sort of taken the mantle from him in modern Christianity, and he's always quoting, and I'm always quoting this one line from Willard about that. He says, "Grace is not opposed to effort; it's opposed to earning." And so it opens the door to the possibility that, oh, like this is something I can engage in and put my energy towards, rather than there's it's just a shut door. There's nothing to do about it. Like, we'll talk to you when you get to the pearly gates, but just assume that you're good, but maybe keep tabs on your sinful habits or whatever. It's like, no, none of that is the way that even life presents itself to you experientially. You don't experience your life as just this one. Well, I hope people don't experience it as this one long, waiting room experience before you get to what's really going to happen. I think this bottom up participation is so engaging. I don't know. It's participatory. You get to participate in this pattern of all patterns that you were talking about earlier. Like you begin to take the form that you were intended to take in a way that I know for me, just like anecdotally, my life was a mess. Like that's what people say. Everything was chaotic. It was disordered. I took some sort of form because I needed to have enough money to pay for rent, right? Because I didn't want to be homeless. So I had some sort of organizing principles. But then when it came to like how much drugs you should do on a weekly basis, or how much alcohol you should drink before 10 a.m., or all of these other things, there weren't strong enough, like there wasn't discipline, there wasn't values or virtues that could help me to take a proper shape or a useful shape even. And so that was a mess. But then as I have come to Christ and begun to desire participation in the pattern that he exhibits, it's almost like I can't help but begin to put these things into place. Like they begin to orient toward myself begins to orient towards him in a way that organizes all of the different aspects of my life. And that's just at the bottom level. Then you get to like the conscious level of, am I going to sleep in or am I going to get up? Because I know that taking time to just have silence to begin the day or scripture to begin the day is so helpful in this endeavor to, flesh out the pattern that he is, drawing out of me or willing me up into.
Yeah. A few things come to mind after hearing this. Honestly, the interpenetration of like top-down grace with bottom-up striving brings me back to the zombie, because we talked a lot earlier about how the zombie represents our meaning crisis, and I think we also see in the zombie myth the solution to the meaning crisis, which is, in my opinion, liturgy, especially Eucharistic liturgy, because, as I said earlier, the zombie tries to caricature communion by just eating without being thankful. But this is exactly like in the Eucharist, Jesus gives himself, his body, to be eaten, and by eating him, we become part of him. So, like, it's funny because it's something that the zombies cannot resist, and there are even some like bits of culture going in that direction. There's the Warm Bodies movie and book that came out a few years ago, where you have a zombie that becomes a human by giving himself to others, essentially by sacrificing himself to try to save others. And like, this is what Jesus does in the story of the Incarnation, and it's what we're supposed to do to participate in his life. And by doing that, it is true that the meaning crisis will be solved. As you said, like, the perennial problems will be progressively solved. And it's in this interesting interpenetration where, if you go participate in the liturgy, something is given to you. Like, you inherit a tradition that has built up a lot of stuff that will speak to you, will transform you in ways that are conscious and unconscious. And you also have to do your part. Like, you have to like go physically, like help prepare with others. You have to like sing, read, whatever. Like, you are doing stuff. Obviously, this is in a ritual fashion. Like, it's a condensed version of your week, let's say, where like you have, let's say, the moment that's most likely for grace to come down and for you to strive upwards. But like fractally, it's going to happen every day of the week as well, where you will be shaped by the story of the Incarnation if you try to keep it like in mind. If you pray a little bit in the morning and so on, like, it's going to have like top-down effects on you. And bottom up, if you just keep striving, then sometimes the seeds are going to actually land and bear fruit and so on.
I was going to ask you to talk a little bit about the cross and Easter, and I found that to be captivating in the latter half of your book. Maybe you could say a little bit about how it is that you think that the cross does tie into this incarnation and theory of everything, and these problems that we have as we try to orient ourselves in the world.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I can say to begin with is that the cross is the point where you have the highest reaching the lowest of the low. So it's, I mean, we mentioned earlier the basic idea that in the Incarnation you have the interpenetration of all levels of reality, from created reality to uncreated reality, from the material world all the way up to God. And it's interesting that the way this goes is all the way down to the depths of human dysfunction. It's not just that, let's say, God became a man or God became a baby. It's that God became a man that would be treated in the worst possible way. So it's going like in the lowest of the layers possible, and yet paradoxically, it's by doing this that he's also bringing the whole world back to him, back to himself. In obviously, like if you had stopped there, it wouldn't have happened. But the fact that like he's connecting this lowest point with then Easter brings everything together, because when we talked earlier about different levels of reality, when there can be a real jump, and let's say the jump from physics to chemistry, and then the jump from chemistry to biology, and then the jump from like plant life to animal life, the jump from animal life to human sentient conscious life. I see the resurrection as making the same kind of jump from the human body as we know it now to the glorified body. Because what you see, I mean, from scripture you can see it, because like what Jesus does after the resurrection is not what a normal body does. It's clearly in continuity with it, because people still can recognize him a little bit when like at moments, but you can also go through, like he can appear and disappear. He can still eat, but like people sometimes don't recognize him. He still has, interestingly, nails, the holes in his hands and in his side. So there's clearly a continuity, but something different is going on there. And you have many miracles that Jesus did to prepare his disciples for this. C.S. Lewis calls it miracles of the new creation, in contrast to miracles of the old creation. Because you can see that Jesus, in his miracles, in general, miracles are condensations of larger patterns that God always does, but it does them on a smaller, condensed ritual scale, you can say, where, for instance, a miracle of the old creation would be turning water into wine. It's normal for water to become wine, but typically it takes like 1 year, where like you need to plant seeds, and then they're going to grow on grapes are going to grow on vines, and then you need to put the grapes into like earthen vessels, like smash them down, turn it, and so it's a whole process. But you can turn water into wine, but Jesus does it super quickly. So he's working, let's see, you can say, with the laws of nature. I don't like to see the miracles just as going against the laws of nature. It seems to me that they're more going like in condensed, let's say, fashion. So it's still laws of nature, but it's in their purest or elevated form. So sometimes Jesus just recapitulates the old creation, but sometimes he's also introducing a new creation. So when he's walking on water, for instance, that's not a normal thing. Like the human body does have some control on water to an extent, like our bodies are partly made of water and so on. But the fact that we could stand on the waters is an image of the new creation. Where the material world obeys the human mind to a level that's not currently the case. So there's this progressive introduction of the new creation in the story of the Incarnation, but when the shift definitely happens is in the resurrection, when, okay, now Jesus with his resurrected body is doing things that belong totally to the new creation, and doing stuff that people understand even less than when he had his normal human body. And then the idea is that we're supposed to all participate in this. It's clear from scripture, Jesus wanted to invite us to live that life, to be transformed like he was. So to tie that back to the cross, I think even from a theoretician's perspective, I think this is fascinating, because you have, okay, like God was guiding creation, let's say, building up more and more complex forms from the Big Bang, with like, initially there were just, let's say, mathematical laws. At some point you have physics, chemistry, biology, and you have more and more complex and interesting organisms in biology. And then with humans, things go terribly wrong, because of sin, and now it seems like we're making things worse than what you had before because of human dysfunction. But paradoxically, is because God is able to go to the depths of that human dysfunction, that he can do the kind of thing that wouldn't have been possible otherwise, and then elevate creation to a new level that also wouldn't have been possible before. So you have this union, not just of, let's say, divinity with creation, but also creation being united to divinity in a way that like seemed like it wouldn't be possible. Like it didn't seem like it would have been possible to fix what was going on with humanity before the incarnation. But paradoxically, because this goes back to another mystery that I find only Christianity solves. God, what we see from Christianity is that God wanted the world to freely come back to him. Like I said that in the Greek system, it's where it's purely top down. You don't even understand why the world exists at all. If it's just like declinations into non-reality starting from God himself, and by the time you get to pure matter, you have something that doesn't even really exist, doesn't have moral worth. You don't see why creation exists at all. Like why wouldn't Aristotle's or Plato's God just like remain by himself in perfection? Like why bother to create a world at all? So that's a big puzzle in ancient philosophy, and like modern materialists have other kinds of puzzles. They don't. If you try to just think that the world exists bottom up, you just theoretically you just don't get anywhere, because obviously the material world isn't sufficient to explain its own existence. You need God somehow, but the gap between God and the world is just unbridgeable totally within the materialistic system. There's not, you can't even really consider that God exists. You have so many problems in materialism. So anyway, like if you have just the top down or just the bottom up, you're stuck. Like you can't explain that there are very, very deep metaphysical problems you're not able to explain. You can't explain why God is separate from the world. Anyway, like you're just stuck. But with Christianity, you do fix that problem. I think if you add just Judaism, it would be also, if you stopped before the New Testament, I don't think you could really get it either. Obviously, it was there in seed form, but it would have been hard to totally get. But what you have in the story of the Incarnation is that God wants the world to come back to him fully in freedom. In the same way that if you're a parent, you want your child to grow up independently, to be free. And your child, when they grow up and they become free, they can freely decide to love you, to return the love that you've given them. And then paradoxically, that's when you are closest to your child. It is different from what, let's say, you could get from ancient Greek philosophy, which is the top-down system. Like the tendency might have been to just like keep your kid always close to you and not let them grow independently, not give them freedom in the way that like the Greeks didn't think that they had freedom in contrast to God. But in Christianity, you see that, okay, God gives freedom to his creatures in the same way that a parent gives freedom to their child. And paradoxically, that's in doing so that the child will one day be independent and free and mature and will be able to really love their parent. And that's when they will be really close to their parent. That's why they can be like distinct and united to their parent. Yet. And the same thing goes on between God and the world in Christianity, which is not a puzzle I have seen any other philosophy solve, really. So you have that again in the crucifixion. You have like it's super paradoxical, because it looks like the world cannot be separated from God any further than on Good Friday, because the world like took God and killed him. Mm-hmm. It looks like all hope is lost, and like creation is separated from its creator forever. But paradoxically, because then the resurrection happened and Jesus opened the way for creation to participate in God with resurrected bodies, even more than even more than creation participated in God before. Then the cross becomes this point where creation is becoming more like becoming closer to God than it ever would have been otherwise. So you have this paradox, like this both, it's separation and union at the same time.
Yeah, I was going to say, with these bottom up and top down poles, like the opposites, as far as maybe metaphysics or whatever, like when you believe in the bottom up system, you're sort of thinking that you don't have a need. Let me start over. uh, what's intriguing to me about the bottom up and top down opposite is that these ancient Greeks have an understanding that the world is supposed to be some way, but then as it drifts down to the bottom levels, it's almost like entropy moving away from God. And then for the bottom up modernist type people, we have the same entropic disintegration at the top end. And so you at the with the top down, you don't believe that the people are very significant, but from the bottom up, you don't believe that God is very significant. So then to unite them in the center at the cross, and really, Christ's life is phenomenal because it weaves together two things that are very significant, right? You have these ancients that have an understanding of higher order beings that are willing their lives into existence. And then you have the modernist who understands, sort of probably on the backside of the crucifixion and resurrection, that humanity has this immense value. And what's really popping out to me is that the character of the priest mediating between heaven and earth, because you were talking about how can earth be reconciled to God? How can creation be reconciled to God? And it's very interesting to note that. I remember the line in your book about creation groaning through these travails, and it's like I don't traditionally think about creation groaning, right? That's just sort of poetic language from Paul or whatever, but you can see that this pattern reiterates even at the level of parent and child, where it's like, no, I can see I have a 1-year-old son. I could see him groaning to some extent, when I say, no, don't do that, or please go and do that, or any of the things that I'm sort of acting as a boundary for him. And yet I know that my goal is higher order than he can understand at this time. And so we attempt to negotiate that through love, as I love him by sacrificing even just the time it takes to, orient him correctly. I'm hopefully building some sort of reciprocity with him, that he would be able to discern that there's a relationship here he can rely on, such that he can then become one of these independent agents that, I want him to become a priest. I want him to be connected to the divine, such that everything under his purview will be connected to the divine, right? And so each priest is designed as that Christ-like overlap of heaven and earth. And that sounds beautiful. Like, that infuses my mind and heart with meaning and purpose. And I can't wait to go parent my son now, just thinking about it that way. But that's something that, just every generation we have that example to rely on to discern this pattern. And so it makes perfect sense to me that whichever way you look at it, top down or bottom up, you need to be able to interrelate them and not overemphasize one or the other. Because I think I described earlier with my anecdote that maybe I grew up in a Christianity that overemphasized the top down in the same way that the Greeks did, like that this is the way that it is. And there was much less emphasis on the role of a person in connecting God to the people. And so then you don't understand your purpose, because you're not understanding like the essential value that you provide, the usefulness that is inherent to a person.
Yeah. God really wants us to participate. I think the number of mistakes he lets us make. Like, you read the entire story of the Bible, really. Like, it's pretty crazy. Yeah, often humans can stray, and God accepts it and just never ceases to try to bring us to Him. And then when you have stories of repentance that work, then like those are the best stories.
Yeah.
Right? So
yeah, and the through line there is love, and maybe we can close on this. Just it's consistent with the pattern of your book. You weave your way through all of what we've talked about today, and then you get to sort of an outlandish claim that that love is the ground of everything. Maybe put it in your own words, because I feel like I'm misremembering that quote. But how important is love, and how fundamental is it?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what we said earlier with this interpretation of the top down and the bottom up, because you can put this as love. I think that a simple way to put it is love, because you can see love as being both top down and bottom up, and the union of both at the same time. So when the highest gives itself to the lowest, you have the love of this, let's say, the parent for the child, but at the same time, in love, what you have is the desire for the lower to become or to participate in the higher, like the parent, like the child wants to become the parent, wants to grow into, wants to participate in the life of their parent. And when you have both of those things together, you have love too, and you have like the maximal growth, where the lower will be raised up into the higher. The child will become a parent. And yet, at the same time, the parent will become more of a parent, will become greater also in their love. And that means that, for one thing, the elegance that I saw in Christianity in being able to keep the top down and the bottom up together can be summed up in one word, one system. And this isn't something, by the way, that you could see in the alternative systems we talked about. Like in the Greeks, you didn't exactly have love. You have more like there's a kind of drawing up of the lower into the higher, and the Greeks did have the idea of eros, but it's not the same. It's not a Christian love where the lower has freedom to participate really into the higher. You have a limited kind of love, I would say, in the Greeks. So, as you said earlier, it's kind of deterministic. It's not what Christians would typically consider love. And then, on the other side of the spectrum, if you only add the bottom up, if you're like a modern materialist or a modern revolutionary, that you obviously have no love for what came before or what's above. You just want to prioritize the lowest, the new thing, or whatever. So, I think it's no surprise that Christianity puts so much emphasis on love, and that it's able to explain both the top down and the bottom up in the intellectual realm. And for me, to go even further with this, it explains a mystery that it's very, very nerdy mystery, I guess, but a mystery in the philosophy of physics that I haven't seen any other system explain, which is that, or even you can say in just Platonic philosophy, in the existence of forms in general, which is that it's not clear outside of Christianity what kind of existence forms really have. Like, why? I can even go. I think it's good to use an analog of from that I use in my book, which is panpsychism. Panpsychism is a new. I mean, it's actually pretty old, but it's making noise recently because of the art of consciousness. It's sort of explaining like how the human mind can fit into a materialistic worldview. As we said earlier, that's why zombies are a good representative of materialism, because materialists try to grapple with the art of consciousness. Why is it that we feel? Why is it that we see colors, we have emotions, and that kind of stuff? Why aren't we just robots or zombies? And the attempt that panpsychists take here is to say that, okay, the nature of physical entities in general is conscious, and it can seem a bit fantastical, but it's actually a real problem in the philosophy of physics. We know physical entities in general just by their behavior. We know why. I mean, we have laws that can help us explain, that can help us predict, I should say, that electrons behave this or that way when you do this and that thing, but we don't know what electrons really are. Even if we say that electrons have this mass and this charge, all it means is that if we put this value in this equation or this value in that equation, then we can get that output and we can predict this and that thing, but we never know really what an electron is. And that's true for all of science, really. Like in principle, science only describes entities extrinsically, just using abstract forms for their description, like math, like we said earlier. And if you want to take the ontology of science seriously, you want to think that, okay, like electrons really do exist still, like, but what is their existence if we don't have access to it somehow? So what panpsychists do is to say that, well, it's going to be consciousness, because then I can have this nice continuity between, okay, electrons can be described with physical laws and they are conscious, very simple consciousnesses, obviously, but then so are humans. Humans could be described by physical laws, very complex physical equations, but still they can be described physically with just math. But intrinsically, what is the nature, what breathes fire into those equations is human consciousness. When we decide to do something, that's the real driver, which might be explained someday using a very complex equation, but that's just the extrinsic explanation. The real intrinsic explanation is my desire to go and do something. And the same would go for the electron. Like the electron would have some desire to get close to protons, but and also some desire not to get close to other electrons, let's say. And that would be the real driver behind the electron, the real nature of the electron, which you could describe using laws, but that's only the extrinsic description. And but there are all kinds of theoretical puzzles if you stay with panpsychism. Like it's really unclear how consciousnesses can combine if you just take panpsychism. But more so, especially given what we said earlier, if you take just potential and forms, it's not clear that those things are conscious. Like if you take just like the Pythagorean theorem, I don't think the Pythagorean theorem is conscious, at least in the way that people want to talk about consciousness typically. Like you could say like it's some kind of intelligent pattern, but it's unchanging and it doesn't look like it's acting in any way. So saying consciousness is a bit, I think, stretching the term. And then similarly, I think that potential really exists, and I think we want to see the potential exists because of all the social implications that we mentioned earlier. Like in ethics, I think it's really hard to value women and children and the poor if you think that potential is just an illusion. So I think we want to hold on to that, but if you're a panpsychist, potential is like it's not consciousness. I don't even know that you could stretch the term consciousness to potentially like talk about potential. So all that is to say that I understand the desire that panpsychists. I used to be a panpsychist to solve the hard problem of consciousness, but a much better solution is love, because you can see potential as love for higher forms, and you can see forms as love to structure, to give themselves to potential. Like the mother and the child again, we can take as an example. The child is potential. They will grow up, they have all kinds of things they can do, and they strive towards their mother. And conversely, the mother shapes their child by loving them, by reflecting and structuring what the child is feeling. It's pretty well established now in child psychology. Like children are formed by their interactions with their caregivers, especially their mothers. That's the ideal, where the mother will sort of absorb what the child is feeling very incoherently, very chaotically, and will reflect through her voice, her expressions, her touch, what the child was feeling, but in a slightly more structured way. And through this loop that the mother does unconsciously, just because she loves the child and because the child is loving her back, the child will grow into an independent person, structured with emotions, with understanding that he's not the same thing as his mother, but still through that distinction that happens through their love, they will only get closer over time because the child will be independent and will be able to love their mother for real. So I think Christianity gives us a very impressive theory of everything, where you can understand the whole hierarchy of forms and matter that we talked about earlier as love all the way through. It lets us understand the nature of electrons. It lets us understand the relationship between a child and their mother. It lets us understand the relationship between God and the world. And that's why I think the quote you were getting to earlier is that, in my opinion, love is what gets us closest to the art of everything. If we want to understand how electrons behave, it's useful to have equations. But if you want to know what electrons are like at their deepest, what anything is really at its deepest, it's love. Everything is created by the love of God and is meant to love God back in return by participating at their own level in love. So for an electron, as I said earlier, it might be a love for protons, like physically getting close to protons, but not getting too close to electrons. For us, let's say as fathers, it might be to give ourselves to our children, but not absorbing them, also letting them grow independently. So if everyone participates in love at their own layer, they are participating in that highest of love, which is God, and that united itself with creation through the incarnation, especially.
That's making me think of a triadic structure a little bit, that there would be form and potential, and then in between that would be sort of like incarnation or instantiation. And I think that you're onto something when you find a triadic structure. That's probably not always true, but it seems to prove itself out when I put it to the test. I thank you so much for this conversation. It was delightful, and it was beautiful to put a face to the book and get to interact with you. I appreciate the target audience and your heart for them, and your desire to maybe invite people into this pattern of all patterns that you found to be so helpful in your life. I want to ask, like, what you're up to these days. Do you have anywhere to send people? I'll definitely link the book in the description.
Perfect. The book, Post-Reductionist Christianity, A Way Out of the Meaning Crisis. Links will be below. It's published by the Symbolic World Press, established by my friend Jonathan Peugeot. So these days I'm actually most active in French. So for your listeners, that might be a blocker. In general, I guess it fits with what we said earlier. I felt like I was living a pretty abstract life with philosophy, and I'm glad I took that time. But now I'm trying to sort of take routes to go top down and build stuff locally. So as far as I'm online, I do stuff mostly in French. Even trying to do stuff like about my own culture and what we can do symbolically here to help people out. I'm more involved in person, like in like parish level or community level events. But I still publish stuff in English from time to time on abstract issues that I think about that are relevant for me locally, and that might be relevant to others. I think probably the best place to follow what I'm doing is either my YouTube channel. You can search for my name, JP Marceau, or on Twitter. I post everything I do on Twitter. There will be lots of French stuff that pops up on my Twitter. But typically when I publish something, so I'll sort of write an article here and there from time to time, or appear in a podcast or something. But for my articles, I typically record an audio version on my YouTube channel, so people can find it there. I'd say in general, probably Twitter is the best place to find to follow what I'm doing. And if you know French, then you'll have more stuff there.
Maybe everyone who's been trying to learn French for their New Year's resolution will find this to be helpful for them. Also, everybody, ChatGPT, Grok, just translate it.
That's true.
All right. Thanks, JP. Appreciate it.